Welcome to the Compliance 911 Show, a no-nonsense podcast discussing hot topics for today's busy compliance professional. It's everything you wanted to know about regulatory compliance, but we're afraid to ask. And now, here are your hosts, Dean Stockford of M&M Consulting and Len Suzio of GeoData Vision.
Hey, Dean, it's nice to see you again and commence another podcast. It's hard to believe yet another year is coming to a close. To date, we've broadcast over 80 podcasts, and our viewership continues to set records. More recently, we have focused on some of the more pressing issues like fair lending, CRA, and Section 1071. So what do you have on tap for today's podcast?
Hey, Len, it's great to see you. First, I thought, each of us could share our thoughts on, I always called it the blockbuster event, but the recent election and what the impact may have on some of the hot topics that you just quite frankly mentioned, such as CRA and Dodd-Frank's 1071. Not to mention the enforcement around the redlining initiative by the various regulators. In addition to that, I'd like to highlight, because it's, again, I think hot off the press, the recent BSA AML enforcement and penalties that were assessed against the 10th largest bank in the United States, TD Bank.
Geez, Dean, it sounds like instead of a 10-minute podcast, we're going to have a 10-hour podcast.
Good.
No, I promise our listeners we're going to keep it to our traditional 10 to 15 minutes and probably continue the discussion in future podcasts. So, and of course, I would love to share my thoughts on the recent election. As you know, Dean, I was a state senator for several terms in the Connecticut State Senate. And to say the least, my experience was eye-opening. I don't think it would surprise our audience that many legislators don't really understand the complex issues they are voting on. And certainly all legislators leave it to the bureaucracy. In other words, the regulators themselves to interpret and apply the laws that the legislators have voted on and passed. And certainly the recent federal election has resulted in a monumental shift of control to the Republicans in terms of the presidency, as well as the House and the Senate. But aside from that, it means that the control of the bureaucracy, in other words, the agency heads, will change too. And that's where we're likely to see some impact, even before any legislative action. In fact, the Biden administration itself actually set precedent back in 2021 when the OCC rescinded the 2020 CRA rule that had been passed by the OCC only a few months earlier. I think that's where we're likely to have much more significant and much more immediate impact on the regulations. And I expect that that'll happen and even precede the results of the litigation, which is ongoing regarding the Community Reinvestment Act passed in 2023 and the Section 1071 rule, which was also passed a little over a year ago as we record this session in November of 2024. So there's lots on hand. I can only say to bankers that while I think there's a lot of changes that are likely to happen, the prudent thing to do is to plan on a continuation of the path that's been set in terms of the Community Reinvestment Act and Section 1071 in particular, and wait to see how things unfold. It would be a mistake to anticipate change when you don't even know what the change might be. And I would encourage our audience, therefore, to keep planning on Section 1071 becoming effective July 18th of 2025 for the Tier 1 lenders, and then in January thereafter for Tier 2, and then the October after that in 2026 for Tier 3. And let's see what happens. If it changes, it changes.
Yeah, no, good points, Len, and I'm glad I was able to pick your brain on that a little bit. I know certainly elections have consequences, and as you pointed out, it appears the Republicans will rule the House, the Senate, the presidency, a trifecta, which is essentially a mandate to get things done. In history, if you look back trending-wise, it certainly points to some level of deregulation and a shift in priorities by the regulatory agencies. But we'll have to wait and see, as you indicate, to see how it will play out. I do want to throw a little caution out there, and I think you just kind of indicated, what those mandatory dates were. But folks should not start wait. They should start implementing those changes if they haven't already, especially under 1071 and CRA. Although the new administration may modify or roll back or repeal or whatever action they may decide to take, I think history again repeats itself, and it will take, quite a bit of time, 18, 24 months or even longer, before we start to see any type of deregulation, I guess is the way to put it.
Yeah, good point and great advice, Dean. But I'm also anxious to hear more about the recent $3 billion, that's billion, penalty handed down to TD Bank. I heard about this and was astonished at the size of the penalty. I haven't had the time myself to really look into it, so I will be one person listening closely to what you have to say about that.
Oh, the penalty is significant, Lynn, for sure. But I think the bigger issue is that TD Bank became the first bank in the country to actually plead guilty to conspiracy to commit money laundering. And that to me is the blockbuster statement or the blockbuster
Wow.
issue for sure.
Yeah, I mean, stunning would be a more appropriate word, I would say. And you would think, especially a bank that size, with all the layers of defense they should have built in with their compliance department and function, you would think that would not be possible. So definitely, I'm listening. I'm
Yeah,
all
well,
in.
you're spot on too. I asked myself that question over and over and over again, but the big issue appears to be laid out in the press release from the Department of Justice, which said that TD Bank, for years, starved its compliance program of the resources needed to obey the law. In other words, they're spending money in all the wrong areas, I guess is the way to put it. But for years, we've stressed the importance of resources, and that is both systems and people. You can't just invest in one without the other. This is extremely important in order to carry out an appropriate compliance management systems that are designed, again, with some context behind it. The size, the complexity of the institution, geographical locations, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot that needs to be done. And clearly, I think that TD Bank did not throw the right amount of resources in this particular high risk area.
Yeah. And Dean, even if you have the people and you have the systems and procedures in place, it's important to make certain that they've been implemented, because a lot of banks think, oh, I'll put some window dressing on this and we'll look good. We'll have the people designated to do this and that. But it's important to make certain that the systems and procedures are being implemented by the people assigned to it. So really interested to hear more about this TD Bank situation. Can you give us the 30,000-foot view on what actually happened, Dean?
Yeah, I'll try to stay out of the weeds a little bit, but you are right when you say implemented. Yes, you do have to implement. You also have to place controls around monitoring it to make sure that, of course, it's been implemented and working and tested. So certainly a lot there. But in summary, yes, Len, they had pervasive BSA AML program failures. And for those listeners who maybe just be tuning in for the first time, maybe new to banking, BSA is the Bank Secrecy Act and AML is anti-money laundering provisions under the rules. But the first thing that I read, when I was reading the consent was in the civil money penalties, the order itself, that the bank failed to develop and provide for continued administration of their program reasonably designed to assure and monitor compliance with all of the record keeping requirements under BSA, which is a true violation. And that's really what you and I were just saying. Policies, procedures, also you got to implement those, you got to monitor it and test it. Internal controls, tremendous breakdown in internal controls. And in some cases, obviously, when they conspired to do things, there was a lot of illegal and illicit activity. Risk management, risk assessments. This is something that's been ongoing, and regulators have been, quite frankly, spot on, in my opinion, when it comes to risk management, risk assessments. Don't just put things in a risk assessment for the sake of putting things in a risk assessment. You got to put sufficient quantifying and qualitative and quantitative detail in those risk assessments, and try to think out of the box and think ahead. But make sure you're quantifying those risks. The end game, obviously, trying to get to a residual risk for the institution so that it can allocate resources accordingly. customer due diligence and ratings. This is quite frankly been in place for quite some time now, CDD. And what that really is profiling on many levels your customer. So that you know whether or not they've deviated from normal expected activity. And, and that is usually borne out in suspicious activity monitoring. And one of the things TD Bank did was they didn't monitor adequately for suspicious activities. They didn't identify as a result of a lack of monitoring. They didn't evaluate circumstances where maybe it should, a suspicious activity occurred or didn't. And then they didn't report accordingly. And, regulators look at both. They look at what we call SAR filings and also SAR non-filings, because, that kind of gives you, I always say, the appetite of what's going on internally within the institution, and then the level of sophistication and oversight relative to suspicious activities as well. Staffing and training, obviously, that the DOJ said that, right? And sufficient resources. Well, you still got to train the resources as well.
Mm-hmm.
And then one big thing, and I take this really to heart, and that's the independent testing. I mean, these people do their due diligence. So TD Bank does their due diligence. They hire a firm like an M&M to come in and conduct the independent testing. And that company failed. They failed, even though that is the last line of defense, in effect. They failed miserably there. So again, conducting appropriate due diligence in size doesn't always matter. I know we're often looked at as a very small company, but we have all the resources and we can do all the things of the big guys, except I think in certain cases, of course, I'm biased, but I think we do a little more hand-holding, and we do get into the weeds and really take pride in fleshing out a lot of the issues that were identified at TD Bank. In addition, the bank had significant, long-standing, and systemic breakdowns in their monitoring program. So really all the things we were just talking about, monitoring for suspicious activities, is there a change? And then what did we do about it? And then since at least 2020, the bank processed hundreds of millions of dollars worth of transactions, which were clear indicators of highly suspicious activity, which created significant money laundering, terrorist financing, or illicit financial transactions, which are really all of the elements under suspicious activity monitoring and filing. The bank repeatedly failed to take appropriate and timely corrective action to address highly suspicious activity, and failed to properly emphasize the importance of that within their BSA AML program. So that's significant. The bank had systemic breakdowns in policies, procedures, processes to identify and report on SARs, in a pattern and practice of non-compliance with filing SARs, which is, again, very, very strict timeframes for identification and reporting. But we also have to keep track of those SAR, what we call non-filings, that where we contemplated, because it's important and it does show a high level of internal control. The bank violated CTR, or currency transaction violations, on numerous occasions. That's if anybody that has cash in or out in excess of $10,000 in the aggregate in a single day, we have to monitor for that, and then we have to report those accordingly. And it sounds like TD Bank fell miserably on that. The bank failed to implement appropriate risk-based procedures for conducting their ongoing customer due diligence. Here again, ask questions up front, establish a baseline of risk, know when you have to adjust for that risk as you move forward based on circumstances, events, transaction activity, whatever it may be, but be ready to modify that. And it sounds like they didn't. It sounds like they just completely ignored customer due diligence overall. The bank also recklessly, and that's the term that they used in the order itself, engaged in unsafe and unsound practices related to its overall program. And then last but not least, and of course there's much more getting into the weeds, but the bank's violations, recklessly unsafe and unsound practices, were part of a pattern, and it caused and likely caused more loss to the bank. And that's just, significant, Len. And so I think when you start unpacking all of this, you can see that the regulators took more than a shot across the bow. They got the attention of every bank in the entire country. I am certain of that. But generally speaking, and I do want to generally speak on behalf of most banks, they do a very, very good job and take this very serious. So this was an eye-opener, to say the least, Len.
Yeah. Sounds to me more like a case of almost willful blindness. When I was first learning about BSA and AML years and years, decades ago, I remember one person was teaching me, said, SAR, S-A-R. It's not suspicious activity report. It's something ain't right report.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
in this case, it definitely is something wasn't right. That's for sure.
Yeah. There's no question about that. And you are correct. It is clear that the bank had, different priorities for sure. I mean, they were, looks like, taking a priority of profits over compliance, which a lot of folks do. But you got to balance both. You can't just go all in on one side without the other. You need to make sure you got sufficient controls in order to comply with the requirements of the law. And yes, you can make money in doing that as well. So, good luck to TD Bank. I hope that they will survive this and that they will act accordingly, because this is very, very serious. And we'll just have to wait and see.
Well, Dean, this certainly was an interesting and timely topic today. I'm certain our listeners have found it helpful, and hopefully they'll avoid the problems that TD Bank has endured and the cost of that negligence. Thank you for this invaluable information. This is Len Suzio with Geodata Vision.
And this is Dean Stockford from M&M Consulting saying thank you for listening to today's podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Compliance 911 Show. If you like the podcast, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. While you're at it, please give us a like and review to help others find the show. As always, links are in the show notes, and you can always find us online at compliance911show.com. Follow M&M Consulting and Geodata Vision on LinkedIn for all the latest news and information on compliance hot topics.